Hi there and welcome to Power Play. I'm Vashi Capellos in Ottawa on this Thursday. Tonight, U.S. Senate support.
Trump is letting his delicate little ego drive U.S. trade.
He's turning Main Street into Pain Street in every single state in our country.
Senate Democrats gain Republican support to pass legislation against Trump's tariff regime on Canada. Days before that, country's Supreme Court hears a legal challenge of the president's trade war. In moments, the Attorney General leading that case, Oregon's Dan Rayfield, will join us live to talk about the case. Then, Grinch or negotiate?
Tell the leader of the opposition, that Grinchy guy, don't steal Christmas from our kids.
It's a question of negotiation. It's a question of making sure that we are reflecting priorities for different members of Parliament.
As the politics of the upcoming budget dominates debate on Parliament Hill, plus speculation about an election, the content of that budget is still being finalized. What will Parliament's budget watchdog be looking for? Jason Jakes will be here coming up, and I'm going to ask him. Plus, we'll tackle how politically important that budget doc will be, plus the possibility of an election with our front bench. Christy Clark, Marco Mendicino, James Moore, and Tony Clement will all be here a little bit later on in the show. First, though.
Thank you very much.
Anything on Canada? Anything on Canada?
We had a very nice conversation with him last night. We really did.
U.S. President Donald Trump commenting briefly on Canada after dining with Prime Minister Mark Carney at a group dinner hosted by South Korea's president. It's been exactly a week since the president shut down trade talks with Canada, claiming to be angered over an Ontario government anti-tariff ad. But the president is, to be sure, also facing opposition on the home front, with the U.S. Senate passing legislation to nullify his emergency order tariffs on Canada.
On this vote, the yeas are 50, the nays are 46. The joint resolution is passed.
The Democrat-led effort passed 50 to 46, supported by 4 Republicans. While it won't actually end Trump's tariffs, it does highlight pressure on the president.
Donald Trump has stopped the discussions because a TV ad hurt his feelings. Tariffs are hurting our economy, hurting our citizens, hurting our businesses.
This is a country with which we share a trade agreement that this president negotiated. If you want to make changes, like for dairy or other things, do it in the review of that agreement. Don't do it like this to a neighbor and friend.
This has been the most peaceful relationship over the centuries. And Donald Trump seems to throw a hand grenade to undo that relationship. While he capitulates to Beijing, he's raising tariffs on Canada. How nonsensical, how stupid, how thoughtless.
That vote is playing out less than a week before the issue hits the Supreme Court, after much of the president's trade war was deemed illegal by lower courts following a case brought by a coalition of state attorneys general, led by the Attorney General of Oregon, Dan Rayfield, who is with us live right now. Mr. Rayfield, good to see you again. Thank you very much for making the time.
Yeah, great to see you too.
Do you think that Donald Trump's decision to cut off talks with this country had something to do with the upcoming hearing at the Supreme Court?
I really think that it was a matter of hurt feelings. It was truly the behavior of a toddler and not the behavior of an adult who's leading the country, the United States. It was absolutely wild to just be personally offended by something you see on TV and then have it impact the rationality with which that you're going to engage in international trade talks. But that's the type of president that we have right now, incredibly thin-skinned in the way that he deals with issues right now.
What do you make of congressional support in the form of 2 different things? First, what we just spelled out happened in the Senate overnight, but also a brief, a sort of bipartisan brief that was sent to the Supreme Court, essentially advocating in favor of the stance that you and your colleagues have taken.
Yeah, first and foremost, Congress should never have had to act in the first place. The president does not have the constitutional authority to do what he is doing right now. He doesn't have statutory authority to do what he's doing right now, and that has been upheld in 2 levels of courts, and next week will be in the United States Supreme Court arguing that. But the mere fact that Congress felt compelled to act says a lot in our country. It says that people are listening to common sense economics. It says that people are listening to, frankly, the former president. President Ronald Reagan, the standard bearer for the American Republican Party, in what he talked about, how free trade benefits multiple countries. It keeps prices lower. So you start to see some of his own party getting really anxious, which I think is really normal because you got Thanksgiving around the bend. You've got Christmas around the bend. You've got grocery bills going up in the United States. Right now, one of the biggest headlines is the cost of beef is going through the roof because of the actions that the president is taking.
What is your sense of, and I ask sort of your sense of where public sentiment is on this, and you're seeing some, as you point out, manifestations of opposition. But we, I think, here in Canada have been surprised, or were surprised initially into the first number of months of his presidency, at how little opposition there appeared to be versus, let's say, in the first round of NAFTA negotiations, when we had a lot of allies advocating for the benefits, the mutual benefits of free trade. Do you sense a shift at all in public sentiment? And ultimately, do you think that will be reflected in additional pressure on the president?
Yeah, and I want to pivot what you said a little bit. There are some people who are just going to agree with whatever the president says, just like you'd probably have some Democrats that will agree with whatever a Democratic president says. What I would tell you, the most unpopular thing through polling across all Americans is how Trump is handling our economy and tariffs. And the reason why is just common sense, right? When you go to the grocery store, you see your prices increase. When you go to back to school supplies, you see your prices increase. When you start going to buy new clothes for your family and you see the prices increase, that's just flat unpopular. And right now we have an affordability crisis, I think across the world, but really in America as well, as the haves and have-not gap continues to widen. And this is a policy that is exacerbating that. At the same time, mind you, this same president is yanking back benefits on food benefits, food assistance for the most neediest people, and healthcare benefits. So this stuff is really hitting home for all Americans, and it doesn't matter who they are, Republicans or Democrats. You're seeing that really resonate, and that's why I think you're seeing some Republicans start to defect, and that is why this issue has just grown to be a monstrous economic problem for the president.
I wanted to get sort of some detail on the legal aspect of all of this, of course, what you will be arguing before the Supreme Court. The president has used something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to justify his application or the levying of these tariffs. What is your legal argument against him doing that?
Yeah, in legal arguments, sometimes you start thinking this is really complicated, right? But it's not. This is one of the most simple cases. Specifically, every president in the history of the United States has used a specific set of statutes that are really geared towards giving the president a little bit of power with sideboards to administer tariffs. This president didn't use those statutes. He was the first president to ever use an emergency power that had never been used to set tariffs to do this. It's really specific. The language of that statute doesn't give the president power to do tariffs. And that's why the two lower courts agreed with us in our arguments.
If you are successful before the Supreme Court, do you ultimately think it will put a stop to the use of these tariffs, the kind of tariff regime that the president is employing, or do you anticipate he'll find other ways to apply them?
Yeah, we've got a president who's living in archaic economic times, the times of like the early 1900s when people thought tariffs were a good idea. So I fully anticipate that his archaic beliefs on how the modern economy is run are going to persist into the future, and I think he'll try and be creative on how to implement tariffs. However, if the courts uphold our lawsuit and rule with us, it is going to put the appropriate sideboards on, the sideboards that Congress put in place, which really limit the duration, they limit how high they can be. And so these really effective sideboards that will not wreck the relationships between countries, it will require factual findings, it will have reviews, it will be thoughtful when you do these things. If we can get the president back to using the statutes that Congress intended, that's going to be good for all nations.
Are there also potential refund liabilities? Like, for example, if you are successful, will the state of Oregon be able to sue the federal government to get money back?
Yeah, these are things that go on. You think about it, what you teach your kids, right? If I told my son, don't throw the baseball near the window, and I tell him it 5 times, and on the 6th time he throws the baseball near the window and he breaks it, that is his responsibility. When Trump was told over and over again by multiple judges, probably by his own lawyers, to be honest, that what you're doing is not constitutional, you have to be responsible for that. Businesses should not have to bear the burden of a president who's unwilling to follow the law in our country. And he should reimburse those companies because they deserve it. A lot of companies in Canada, in the United States, across the world, don't have the biggest margins to be able to afford these things. And that's why it's going to be so important to make sure that we keep our businesses whole. It's good for our economy, it's good for jobs, and frankly, it will keep the prices that all of us pay down.
The president has finally, Mr. Rayfield, mused about showing up in court this week. What are your thoughts on that? And ultimately, do you think it has anything to do with trying to up pressure on the court?
Of course, this is a president who, loves his community theater, and that's, what I would call it. This is not professional theater. This is community theater. He would have given me a run for my money when I tried community theater at a younger age. But this is what he does. He's coming into an independent branch of government, our judiciary, trying to push his weight around, trying to flex his muscle. And that is not what an executive power should ever do. And that's why no other president in the history of this country has ever tried to do that. But this isn't the first time. This is a president, he whines and complains more than my dog at the dinner table on Thanksgiving when he doesn't get his way. And he will sit there and he will threaten judges' impeachment if he doesn't like the ruling that they're getting. That is not what you do. Democracies are founded on having an independent judiciary, a check and a balance on both Congress and the president. So I'm patently offended that any president would even consider coming in and trying to influence the decision of an independent judiciary. That is not a democracy. That is not how things run. And I really hope that he has a little bit more common sense than walking into that courtroom on Wednesday.
Are you worried he might be successful in trying to do that?
If he comes in to the courtroom, he is an American. He gets to, and if he can find a seat appropriately to be in that courtroom, that's the choice he gets to make. What I think is that there are certain lines that we draw in the sand of a healthy democracy or republic, and that is a line that would be crossed by the president. I don't think any member of Congress, any politician, any president, or frankly, anyone in any community should be pressuring the judiciary to make a decision one way or the other. This is a place for facts. It is a place to apply law sterilely to get the right decision for all Americans. It is not a place to throw your political weight around. And frankly, I think it could backfire on him. If I was a justice, even if I was a more conservative justice, and I saw a president trying to influence the decision, that is what dictators do. That is exactly how it would reflect to me if I was sitting up on that bench, and I would be offended.
Okay, I'll leave it on that note. Mr. Rayfield, appreciate your time and your insights this evening very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's Oregon State Attorney Dan Rayfield. He will, of course, be arguing the case before the Supreme Court next week. That case, the hearing into that case, gets underway the day after our federal budget on November 5th. We are going to talk about that and the latest dynamics between Canada and the U.S. with our front bench coming up a little bit later in the show. There they are, Christy Clark, Marco Mendicino, James Moore, and Tony Clement. They're also going to talk about the possibility of a Christmas election because that debate is as hot as it gets in the House of Commons, in particular, whether the budget will force that election. The parliamentary budget watchdog, Jason Jakes, will join us next to talk about what could be in that budget. Back in a moment.
Canadians can't afford this Liberal government when we see layoffs from coast to coast to coast that we've never seen before. Why is it that Canadians are being asked to make sacrifices?
Go over and talk to the leader of the opposition. Say, don't be a Grinch. Don't cause a Christmas election. Vote for this budget and make Canada the best economy in the G7.
They laugh all the way to the bank while Canadian workers cry all the way to the food bank. When will this Prime Minister stop lining the pockets of insiders and start delivering an affordable life for Canadians?
Will this member, I'm asking him, walk down the aisle, tell the Grinchy leader of the opposition, vote for the budget, don't ruin Christmas, build
Welcome back to Power Play. Are we in for a holiday election? Liberals in the House of Commons are digging in, accusing the opposition of wanting to steal Christmas if they don't vote to pass their budget. That's in stark contrast to Liberal Defense Minister David McGuinty, who spoke earlier in South Korea about negotiations with parties in the minority House to find common ground.
I have every confidence that we will pass the budget. I think that we will earn the respect and the support in the House. It's a question of negotiations. It's a question of making sure that we are reflecting priorities for different members of Parliament. We're doing that.
It's unclear what strategy the government will actually employ politically, but opposition parties are also figuring out if they're willing to force an election over this budget, due to be tabled Tuesday. On the content of the budget, government sources tell us the document itself has not been finalized. So what do we need to watch for? Jason Jakes is the interim parliamentary budget officer. Hi, Mr. Jakes. Pleasure to welcome you back to studio. Thanks for making the time.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for the invitation.
We're all, of course, thinking of and looking ahead to the budget. You've got a new report out today on capital spending on defense that I think is kind of interesting in the context of the budget. You make two very specific findings about how much they're spending now and also how much they've been unable to spend. What do you think Canadians should know about that in light of the budget coming down the road?
Well, I think on your first point, I think that's one of the key highlights, and that's we currently have within the Government of Canada's spending plan for defence. So this is the capital plan. So this is the F-35s, along with the Navy and other types of armaments. We're looking at around $300 billion over the next 20 years, and that's only for NATO 2%. So this goes back. The data we're looking at goes back to June. It does not include the additional commitment that's been made since that period of time to get up to NATO 5%. So if we're at 2%, 300 billion at 2%, we're looking at substantially more. So additional, potentially hundreds of billions of dollars on defense in order to hit those targets.
And can you put that in a historical context? Like, how much is that? How much money is that compared to what we usually spend?
It is a multiple of what most Canadians would be familiar with. I know there are probably some viewers who would remember World War II, so we're getting close to that period of time, a little bit after probably the 1950s or so. I think during the 1980s and 1970s, we would see defense spending at around 3% of GDP, 3 and a bit percent, going up to 5%, even with the dual purpose aspects, so spending on infrastructure that could be used for defense as well as other areas. Even with that, it's a very high number, and critically, it's a really big increase within a very short period of time.
So in that context, I actually want to ask you, because part of your analysis also reflected on the allocation of money but not spending it over time. And I'm wondering, given that the scope of the planned increase, if that would be a concern for you moving forward.
I think and it's less of a concern for us because we only keep track of the numbers in the budget. It's definitely should be a concern for the government because, as you point out, what we've seen, at least in the first 5 or 6 years of the original plan, was that there was close to $20 billion that they planned to spend on equipment that was not spent. And in the situation where not only do you have to spend the money to achieve the NATO commitment, but as everyone realizes, there are very real and imminent threats that Canada faces at this point. You actually need to procure the equipment and the material. And as time goes by, if you're not able to spend the money, you're not able to procure the equipment. And as well, from an accounting perspective, everyone knows how pernicious inflation is. And so if you don't actually acquire the equipment in the time period provided, by the time you do, the money is worth less. So you potentially have to buy less than when you originally anticipated, or you have to pay more, or a combination of the two.
So the overall budget is under a week away. When you get that budget and you're able to look at it, what kinds of fiscal anchors will you be utilizing to assess the sustainability?
I think the first one is the one that most economists would look to, and I'd say it's the one that the Government of Canada has looked to in the past, and that's the debt to GDP anchor. So what does debt look like in comparison to the overall economy, and is debt growing faster than overall economic growth? And the Government of Canada itself has indicated that a declining debt to GDP ratio is a very important indicator of fiscal sustainability, as well as important for ensuring or securing Canada's AAA credit rating. It's also something that the Liberal Party of Canada campaigned on as part of their election platform in April. And most recently, the Prime Minister indicated, I believe it was September 17th, that declining debt was something that was part of the fiscal anchors for the current government. So that's definitely the first thing that I'll be looking at.
Based on what you've seen announced thus far, and quite a bit has come out about what their intended spending is, we don't know necessarily exactly what they're going to do on the spending where government operations are concerned. But based on what you've seen so far, do you think it is realistic that that ratio would go down?
It's definitely possible. And I think certainly, again, we don't have a lot of clarity right now precisely what the government has in mind. One could foresee a situation where spending and the deficits are substantially higher in the initial years, and there's a substantial increase in spending on capital. And at the same time, in the outer years, economic growth as a result of those investments starts to pick up. And as a result of that, you have a declining debt to GDP ratio in the outer years. And that's, again, what one would hope to see with the potential additional spending that's on the table. The other point of consideration, and something else that we're going to be looking at in detail on this coming Tuesday in the budget, are the cuts. So the Prime Minister has used the word austerity, and I was working for the Parliamentary Budget Office in 2012 with Kevin Page when Kevin had to take the government to court around the transparency or lack thereof with respect to the impact of the cuts. So something we're going to be looking at in detail is, are the cuts actually provided? Is there a listing of the cuts? Can we see the cuts by program? Do we know which public servants are being laid off across those programs? And can the government actually articulate clear service level impacts? Because is
that what constitutes transparency in your mind? Like, those things need to be spelled out. You can't just say, we're going to adjust the workforce by 10,000.
Oh, no. And again, going back to the precedent set by Kevin and the office as part of Budget 2012, that's the foundation. Without that information, parliamentarians, they really won't know what they're voting on in terms of spending constraint and cuts. So that's something that we're definitely going to be looking at in detail as soon as we get our hands on the budget.
One final question for you on the scope of those cuts, because yesterday the finance minister said something very interesting, which I had not heard him say before, in response to questions about what you just mentioned, in that basically the size of the public service had to get to a more sustainable level. Sustainable is the word I believe that he used. And he referenced a period before COVID. If you look at the size of the public service now versus pre-pandemic, what would the scope of that kind of cut look like?
Yeah, if you go back to pre-pandemic, you're looking at tens of thousands of positions potentially eliminated across the public service. Again, on our end, it's less about the people and it's really about the programs. So public servants are hired to support government programs that the people of Canada benefit from. And that's why, notwithstanding, it's a good starting point to figure out how many public servants might be affected by the budget on Tuesday. What we're more interested in is, what are the actual service level impacts and what are Canadians going to feel? Because on our end, one of the things that, as an independent parliamentary budget office, one of the things we've seen in the past is, if the government doesn't have a clear sense of the service level impacts, there's a very high risk of retrenchment. So something is announced, the service level impacts are significant, and politically it's not sustainable to actually carry it out or actually implement what they've initially announced.
And just to be clear, is it acceptable if they say stage one in this budget is the volume, stage two is figuring out how that unfolds?
I guess it comes back to, as a transparency organization, absolutely not.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, I'll leave it on that note, and we'll pay attention to your analysis next week. Thank you so much, Mr. Jakes.
Thanks again.
All right, we're going to take a quick break tonight here on Power Play. After that break, our front bench will be here to talk about how political this budget is getting. Are we in for a Christmas election? Christy Clark, Marco Mendicino, James Moore, and Tony Clement. There they are. We'll tackle that question next.
Instead of asking young people to make sacrifices, why won't they cut out their well-connected friends, put Canadians first, and deliver a budget that Canadians can actually afford?
We will be putting a budget before this House next week this member will have an opportunity to vote for opportunities for young people.
The Prime Minister's housing agency paid out over $30 million in bonuses. Will the Prime Minister ask his elite Liberal insider friends to make sacrifices instead of young Canadians?
What I suggest is that he walk down a few stairs, talk to his boss, tell the Leader of the Opposition, that Grinchy guy, don't steal Christmas from our kids, don't cause a Christmas election.
Budget battle lines, as you can hear, there are being drawn in the House of Commons, with government sources telling us the document is still being finalized. But the Prime Minister has warned cuts are coming so he can spend on choice investments, last week asking an audience of university students in Ottawa to be ready to sacrifice. Pierre Poilievre is diving right into that, hosting what his party is calling a No More Sacrifices event for young people in the Greater Toronto Area tonight. So just how political might this budget become? Are we in potentially for an election? Let's bring in our front bench. Former BC Premier Christy Clark is here. She's a senior advisor with Bennett Jones. Marco Mendicino is former chief of staff to Prime Minister Mark Carney and a former Liberal cabinet minister as well. CTV political analyst and former Conservative industry minister James Moore is with us. He's now a policy advisor at Edelman. And rounding us out this evening, Tony Clement served in senior roles in Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper's cabinet. He's now CEO of Tony Clement International. Hi, everyone. Happy Thursday. Marco, not to say that you're a betting guy. If you were, what are the chances that this budget leads to an election?
Well, I think for those who are betting for an early Christmas present are better off betting for the Blue Jays to win the World Series than having a federal budget. That said, I think we need to be vigilant around complacency, and that's why you're hearing Steve McKinnon sending up these warning flares, in effect telling parliamentarians across the aisle and telling all Canadians, look, we've got a budget. There are important choices that need to be made. Choices around spending, choices around investing when it comes to housing, when it comes to the defense manufacturing sector, when it comes to investing in people. And let's not be complacent about it. Let's not fall asleep at the switch, because then you do get a Joe Clark scenario where, potentially there is a defeated budget and then we're back to the polls. And I don't think Canadians want that. Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about that, James, and sort of what could lead to that kind of, I guess, holiday surprise. Your thoughts on the potential likelihood of something like that occurring, and what will you be watching as far as kind of political jockeying in the next number of days ahead of Tuesday?
I mean, my best guess is maybe a 20%, 25% chance that we'll have an election campaign. And by the way, I think that would really be tragic. It'd be really bad for the country. We have enough economic uncertainty, trade and tariff uncertainty, and instability going on across the country, and certainly more acute in certain regions of the country. This is the last thing we need, and it's really unfortunate that we might be on the cusp of something like this, destabilizing like this, given the momentum that we've had in recent past around major projects, initiatives, breaking down internal barriers to trade, people saying that they're committed to work together in the face of the threat of Donald Trump's tariff and trade policies. I think that would be really tragic. What's unknown, look, the Conservatives are not going to support this, and it's going to be hard for members of Parliament to find excuses not to show up and vote one way or the other. The idea that people can sort of fake or feign illness in order to get away from a vote. You can vote remotely now as members of Parliament, so you really actually have to have a reason not to be there. I'm looking at the NDP. The Bloc Québécois have their reasons to vote for it or to vote against it. The Conservatives have been pretty stalwart and clear in their opposition to this. But the NDP, it's a caucus of 7 members of Parliament. You have a pretty invisible and ineffectual interim leader in Don Davies. It's Don Davies plus 6 basically independent members of Parliament, one of whom is running for the leadership of the NDP, saying that it was a mistake for Jagmeet Singh to have had the confidence supply agreement and to get in bed with the Liberals. So how does she turn around and then not show up and vote when she's running for leader? So I don't know how we reconcile the NDP vote margin here that the Liberals will need. So it's a bit of a dog's breakfast, but it's for Prime Minister Carney to sort it out.
It does feel, Christy, like the NDP will be key here for a couple of reasons. As James articulated, both the Conservatives and the Bloc have laid out a very specific set of demands. I should point out that the government met with the Bloc yesterday, and there might be some wiggle room on some of the demands, but some of them, like OAS boosting, for example, just don't seem really fiscally feasible. The NDP has been the only party that hasn't laid out specific markers. In fact, has been so explicit in the interim leader to say, I'm not at this point going to draw any red lines. I'm very interested in the investment side of things, and I don't want to see big cuts. But to James's point, I don't even know how much power he can exercise over his caucus.
No, well, first of all, let's take a minute to say God bless Don Davies. He's a great member of Parliament from BC, and he is dealing with an impossible situation. It's true. His caucus is all just, they're not voting together. They're all trying to get rid of each other. I mean, it's the most poisonous little group of people that he's stuck leading. God bless him for taking the job on. But I mean, I think at the end of the day, when you look at the Conservatives and where they are in the polls, which is terrible for them. I mean, in terms of a potential outcome if an election was held today, you look at the NDP and how disorganized they are. The Bloc, which is a sometimes unpredictable group, none of them really have a great interest in having an election happen, because if an election was held soon, it's very likely that Mark Carney would be elected with a bigger with a majority rather than the minority he holds now. So building the budget is going to be tricky. There's no doubt about that. But I think my sense of Mark Carney is that he isn't he's not political gamesmanship. He's not Pierre Poilievre. He's a guy who's really trying to think about what do we do to make the country better. So what you'll see in the budget will be thoughtful and I think sometimes very difficult decisions that they've had to make for the country. So, your last guest was talking a little bit about this, Vashi. I think they are going to have to really crack down on the number of civil servants that have been added to the federal government. They should be thinking about dramatically shrinking departments of the federal government, which are represented in provincial governments all across the country. And then they should be thinking about, and they will be thinking about it, because it's 22% of their spending at any given time, is transfers to the provinces. So how are they going to decide are they going to cut those transfers, or are they going to make those transfers contingent on better behavior from governments that are just big spending, deficit building governments across the country? We've got a few. I happen to live in one of those.
Yeah, they haven't signaled anything on that, I can say unequivocally, except for to say during the campaign, especially that they weren't going to cut transfers to other individuals or provinces. But I take your point. And on the point that Christy makes, Tony, around the Prime Minister's intention with the budget, I totally understand that there might be intent there to use it as a very important planning document. But we're in a minority, so it is also inherently political.
Every budget is political. Every single budget every year, or in this case, every 2 years, is a political document. And I'm going to hearken back to what Marco was talking about, 1979. I remember it well. Some of your viewers will too, where Joe Clark and John Crosby presented a budget with an 18 cent a gallon in those days tax hike on gas. And that became the marker for why that budget should not pass. So we can talk all we want. My esteemed panelists, I love them all. We could talk all we want about the chances of the budget passing, but it could be, Vashi, that there is something hidden in that budget that no one has predicted yet that is going to be the point of contact where people are going to say, holy smokes, we never voted for that. And the opposition parties could unite and say, you know what? This is we want to run an election on this aspect of the budget. So I wouldn't put it as extremely unlikely that the budget will not become a turning point for this government, and in fact will not have the votes to pass. It depends what's in the budget.
Do you think that the people writing the budget right now, Marco, are fully aware of the potential politics of it and the fact that this is something that could lead to an election, and therefore internalizing that in the design of it?
Yes, which is why, one, the Prime Minister has met and engaged with members of the opposition at the leadership level, and two, because according to your sources, which are always very good, Vashi, there is still space to finalize the budget. Now, how much space is an open question, but I think it signals to the public that the Prime Minister and the government do remain open to working with parliamentarians of all partisan stripes. And that, in a minority parliament, is the kind of responsible, stable value set that you want to project.
Last word to you on this, James.
Yeah, look, the budget sets apart blocks of funds and can identify specific programs and commitments. But after you get past the budget, the presentation of the budget, there can be negotiations with the Bloc or with the New Democrats to have a particular fund about which, or a particular program about which, the New Democrats can hang their hat on and say to progressive voters, there's enough there that we think that we can vote for this. The question is whether or not Don Davies can corral those 6 votes, or whether or not the Liberals can persuade enough people in the Bloc to either stay home. So it's going to be a very shaky dynamic. It's unfortunate that we're here. It's up to the Prime Minister. It's his obligation to build the parliamentary coalition necessary to sustain his government. He made that commitment to Canadians and to the Governor General, and we'll see how it looks in the coming days. But there's room for him to maneuver within the budgetary framework if he finds that he doesn't have the support immediately on Tuesday.
Okay, I'm going to leave that part of our conversation there. We'll take a quick commercial break. On the other end of that break, we'll tackle the latest between the U.S. and Canada with our front bench. Back in a moment.
The nays are 46.
Now Donald Trump wants to add another 10% tariff on Canada because his feelings were hurt over an ad featuring Ronald Reagan. Can you imagine what an infantile leader we have?
They're our leading trading partner. It's only like a 3 or 4 hour ride to get up to Canada. It is who we are. This 10% additional tariff, you know who it cascades down onto? The small businesses.
Donald Trump has stopped the discussions because a TV ad hurt his feelings. The right answer to the U.S.-Canada relationship on trade is to go back to the table on USMCA, find anything that hasn't worked, anything that can be made better, negotiate and make it better.
Canada has some supporters in the U.S. Senate, with 4 Republicans joining Democrats to pass legislation overnight to end Trump's tariffs on Canada. The vote, however, does not mean tariffs are gone today, but it does signal some additional pressure on the president. Back to break down the state of play with trade talks now stalled is our front bench: Christy Clark, Marco Mendicino, James Moore, and Tony Clement. We were all together exactly a week ago, mere hours, Tony, before the president decided to put an end to negotiations. There's been a lot that occurred in the interim, right? Everything from that ad, some kerfuffles with Ontario's premier, then the showdown of sorts, you could say, or between the U.S. ambassador and the Ontario representative in D.C. here in Ottawa. How would you describe where things are at a week later?
Well, I think it's all very terrible for Canada. I think that this is potentially disastrous for our country. James Moore has already mentioned the uncertainty that has occurred because of the tariff situation. I know for a fact that capital is fleeing this country because of the uncertainty. So every week, every month that we don't have a deal, when Japan has a deal and Korea has a deal and Europe has a deal and the UK has a deal and we don't have a deal, is not good for Canada. So I would just hope that we can get some clarity from the government of Canada, from the Prime Minister of Canada. What is the plan? You got elected because people believe you could do a better job of dealing with Donald Trump. When are we going to see that?
What do you think about that, Christy?
Well, I think we are seeing he's doing a good job of dealing with Donald Trump. And as much as, you know, when we see the president get upset with other leaders and call them names and put the blackball them or whatever he tends to do, we've seen he still talks about Mark Carney as someone he really likes. So it's not a consistent, it's not a consistent easy ride for us, I don't think. But I do think that Carney has really managed himself, held himself well in these negotiations. The reality is, though, that the Americans are going to leave Canada to last. So Tony's right. They're doing deals with people all over the world, but we are their biggest, this is the biggest trading relationship, or one of the biggest trading relationships on the globe. They want to leave us to last to make sure that they can get the best deal possible in this trade agreement that we have between the 3 countries, because they want us to need them as much as possible. They want us to have to give up potentially as much as possible because we're the very last in line. That's the way Donald Trump's mind works, I think. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But I mean, then ask yourself, who do you want sitting at the table across from Donald Trump in that dire, difficult circumstance? I think of all the leaders in the country that have offered themselves up. I think Canadians are still saying, when they talk to the pollsters, they hope that that's Mark Carney.
Should we be worried when we look at those deals, James, for example, that Tony referenced, even the ones made in the last 24 hours, that the best case scenario for South Korea was some sectoral reductions to 15% tariffs, and they had to concede a ton of additional access to the U.S., to their markets? Like, should we be having or should the government, I guess, be very honest with Canadians about, even if we do land a so-called deal, I don't know, like what it will look like?
2 weeks ago, Donald Trump was criticizing China and doubled the tariffs on them. Yesterday, he had a nice meeting with Xi Jinping and cut them in half. So if we arrive at a, quote, deal with regard to tariffs, and we decide as Canadians to walk away from a generation's worth of commitment to having tariff-free access 2 ways between Canada and the United States and also with Mexico, if we decide to walk away from that and normalize tariffs with the United States, what's to say that if we have that new deal and we land on it, that a year from now or a year and a half from now or any time in the next 3 years when Donald Trump is still president, and imagine that the tariff surplus or the trade surplus for Canada continues to grow after we have a settlement of that tariff agreement, that Donald Trump doesn't just turn around and impose new tariffs. So I don't know that, frankly, an agreement with this president on tariffs is necessarily worth that much. What really matters is CUSMA. Tony mentioned we need to have an agreement. We do have an agreement. We have CUSMA. We have the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, which needs to be re-examined, and we have to have that relationship move forward. But also with the United States, let's not forget this thing that's really important. In 10 of the last 12 presidential elections in the United States, the candidate that won Michigan and won Pennsylvania was elected president of the United States in 10 of the last 12 elections. When you hear Pennsylvania, hear steel jobs from Canada going south. When you hear Michigan, hear auto jobs from Canada going into the United States. This dynamic of trade tariffs and Trumpism is going to last a long time, way beyond Donald Trump. This is not just about Carney and Trump getting along. It's not just about tariffs. I think there's been a real tectonic shift between Canada and the United States on the issue of the Electoral College, Pennsylvania and Michigan, and the fact that the United States needs $30 billion in tariff revenue that they're now getting from the tariffs coming into the U.S. Treasury. This is a really complicated conversation that's not going to be fixed overnight by a quick handshake and conversation between Trump and Carney. And I think that anybody thinks that this is just about getting a deal with a guy whose word doesn't really seem to mean very much in the form of the president, I think is playing, a quick game and fooling themselves about the nature of the threat that we have in solidifying an independent Canadian economy.
And I wonder, as I listen to that, Marco, I think about how worrying that is actually for CUSMA. Because right now, what is insulating our economy from the worst of it is the protections afforded to us through that free trade agreement. We're counting on a process unfolding that is spelled out in the agreement, in the way that it is spelled out. Can we actually count on that?
Well, I think we have to continue to follow the process and fight hard to protect the principles that are under CUSMA, which, again, leverage the integration of our two economies, the labor resources that exist on both sides on critical sectors like auto and steel and others. And I do want to pick up on what James said, because while the vote in the Senate yesterday was largely symbolic, I think it signals that there is a shift in the vocal support from within the Republican ranks when it comes to protecting the principles of CUSMA and trade with the United States and Canada. And I was thinking about, you mentioned the four Republican senators. Two of those Republican senators are in Kentucky, and it struck me that there's nothing like a crisis in bourbon shortage coming to Canada to unite two Republican senators and break ranks with Trump to show their support for Canada. So I think three things need to happen. One, we obviously need to continue to fight hard for the best possible deal for Canada, and that is something that the president has acknowledged that Mark Carney is doing, and doing very well at the world-class level. He is fighting hard. He is a tough negotiator. Two, we've got to make sure that we are diversifying our trade, and that's why the Prime Minister is in Asia as we speak, and he's announced that we've advanced a trade deal with ASEAN. I think that's very important. But third, and perhaps most importantly, and this brings us back to the budget, is we've got to double down on getting things done in Canada. Getting energy to market, making sure that we build out, whether it's with regards to LNG, or whether it's with regards to critical minerals, or whether it's regards to the Ring of Fire
You name it, we've got to get shovels in the ground. And by doing all those three things, that's how we can project prosperity and certainty going forward.
The only thing, the only small caveat, Tony, is that all of that will take a long time. And in the meantime, it feels very, very difficult to inoculate ourselves from the hits that keep coming from the United States.
No, and we're, as the panel has said, we're quite vulnerable. That is absolutely true. And it's a very complicated relationship. That also is true. But the clock is ticking. This prime minister was elected on a mandate to be the best negotiator with Donald Trump, and elbows up and all of the emotions that go along with that. And I get that. But at the same time, this is our most important trade and economic relationship. And prime ministers are judged. Every prime minister is judged in the modern era by how well he keeps that relationship and the interests of Canada on the positive rather than the negative. So this is not just an esoteric question, Vashi. This is pure politics as well as pure economics for Canada. This issue has to be solved, even partially solved, sooner rather than later.
Last word to you, Christy.
Well, I think, we know it will resolve itself some way or another. And I think the challenge that Prime Minister Carney has he set expectations too high? Are people expecting too much of him? Are people going to just assume that he's underperformed, even in a really impossible situation? I think, we started out talking about election. In a bizarre sense, if Mark Carney is seen to have overshot and overpromised and underdelivered in this, I think that's when the Liberals become vulnerable, and I think that's when, not this Christmas, I think that's when you're likely to see an election.
Perhaps in the spring. No, we'll start a pool. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate the discussion. Christy Clark, Marco Mendicino, James Moore, and Tony Clement, our wonderful front bench. We'll take a quick commercial break and more Power Play after that.
I have every confidence that we will pass the budget. I think that we will earn the respect and the support in the House. It's a question of negotiation. It's a question of making sure that we are reflecting priorities for different members of Parliament. We're doing that.
That's Defense Minister David McGuinty speaking earlier today in South Korea, taking a very different tone and tenor from some of his colleagues in the House of Commons on the potential for this upcoming budget, due to be tabled on Tuesday, to force a Christmas election. In the House of Commons, Liberals are telling Conservatives and other members of the opposition that if they don't support the budget, they will be forcing a Christmas election. And the opposition is contending that the onus is on the government to win their support. In that vein, the Prime Minister has met over the past few weeks with leaders of opposition parties. The government also met with the Bloc Québécois. Both the Bloc and the Conservatives, yesterday, both the Bloc and the Conservatives have a very specific list of demands they would like to see met, which turns a lot of attention to the NDP, led by interim leader Don Davies, to see what they're going to do with this budget. I'll leave it there. I'm Vashi Kapelos. Thanks for watching Power Play. Have a great night.